To exercise sports science 324, finance and economics of sport, module 4, antitrust, labor unions, and collective bargaining. Since a textbook chapter is not assigned to this module, our notes on antitrust, labor unions, and collective bargaining will be presented in this PowerPoint presentation and video. Module Learning Objectives 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3 demonstrate an understanding of monopolistic practices in professional sport. Explain the differences in the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. Analyze Major League Baseball's exemption from antitrust laws and its impact on how the sport conducts business. Professional sports leagues and monopolies. Professional sport and monopolies. What do we regularly see in the business of sport? Well, for starters, public subsidies for new stadiums, threats of relocation, viable cities without a professional sport franchise begging to become a major league city, competitive balance issues, high revenue teams dominating small revenue teams, work stoppages, ever-changing dynamics of how fans consume professional sport, and escalating prices, the price-sensitive fan versus the price-insensitive fan. Here are a few interesting questions to consider. Do professional sport leagues control how teams compete against each other for fans, players, media revenues, sales of licensed merchandise, and sponsorship? Absolutely. Do professional sport leagues work together to eliminate competition? Absolutely. Do professional sport leagues hold amateur drafts and restrict athlete salaries? Absolutely. Do professional sport leagues control which cities and owners are allowed to host franchises? And do they pay exorbitant expansion fees? You betcha. Absolutely. The United States sport leagues have been insulated from the normal pressures of doing business because each operates as a monopoly. Let's face it, there is only one top level producer of baseball, football, basketball, and hockey in the United States, and the entry is controlled by the owners. The sport leagues in the United States artificially restrict output to raise the price of their product and value of their enterprise. So, why do we look at professional sport and monopolies in these manners? Well, professional sport leagues in the United States will be the first ones to tell you they do not view themselves as monopolies. They believe in their heart of hearts that they are a single product in the larger entertainment industry and they compete with the industry's other products for the customer's entertainment dollar. There is a semblance of truth to this statement. The key thing to remember is this: how closely are the products related to one another? Monopolists will earn higher profits than competitors. That's the essence of a monopoly. However, the advent of free agency and the strength of the unions have pushed salaries to a level that enables players to share monopoly rents with owners. In other words, they're bedfellows. They have a relationship regarding monopolies. Monopoly rents have tended to be capitalized in the inflated value of the franchises, and new owners who buy into leagues pay a higher price for the team than they would if there were no artificial scarcity of franchises. So all of this leads to two acts: the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. So let's look at the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was a landmark 1890 U.S. legislation that outlawed the concept of trust. That is a group of businesses that team up or form a monopoly in order to dictate the pricing in a particular market. The Sherman Antitrust Act's primary purpose was to promote economic fairness and competitiveness, but most importantly, to regulate interstate commerce. This was the first attempt by the United States Congress to address the use of trusts as a tool that enables a limited number of individuals to control certain key industries. At this point in time in the United States history, we're talking steel, oil, railroads, and finance are the big areas where monopolies were running rampant. The German Antitrust Act also outlawed contracts, conspiracies, and other business practices that restrained trade and created monopolies within industries. So let's look at an example. So the Sherman Antitrust Act says that competing individuals or businesses can't fix prices, divide markets, or attempt to rig bids. It also laid out specific penalties and fines for violating its rules. So it was passed in 1890 and named after Ohio Senator John Sherman. It was a very popular act that signaled an important shift in American history when it came to regulatory strategy toward business and markets. However, the Sherman Antitrust Act didn't have enough teeth to it to really set a precedent, to really break the monopolies that were occurring at the late 19th century and the turn of the 20th century. That's why the Clayton Antitrust Act was needed. The Clayton Antitrust Act is a piece of legislation passed by the United States Congress in 1914. The act defines unethical business practices, goes back to the concepts of price fixing and monopolies, and upholds various rights of labor. The Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division of the United States Department of Justice enforced the provisions of the Clayton Antitrust Act, which continue to affect American business practices today. So the intent was to strengthen the earlier antitrust legislation, otherwise known as the Sherman Antitrust Act, by prohibiting anti-competitive mergers, predatory and discriminatory pricing, and other forms of unethical corporate behavior. Most importantly, it protects individuals by allowing lawsuits against companies and upholding the rights of labor to organize and protest peacefully. Over time, there have been several amendments to the act expanding its provisions. So when we look at the comparison between the Sherman Antitrust Act versus the Clayton Antitrust Act, we're talking about going from being too vague, which was the Sherman Antitrust Act, to more meat on the bones with the Clayton Antitrust Act. When we look at the Clayton Antitrust Act, anti-competitive mergers and the practice of price discrimination come to the forefront, but it also addressed issues the older act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, didn't cover by outlawing insipid forms of unethical behavior. And that was the big thing, where most importantly, the Clayton Antitrust Act banned operations intended to lead to the formation of monopolies. With all that being said, it takes us to Major League Baseball. And Major League Baseball is exempt from antitrust laws in the United States. And this Supreme Court case, Federal Baseball Club versus the National League in 1922, is the primary reason behind it. Let me take a few moments and tell you a story about this Supreme Court case. So, the Federal League was formed in 1913. It was a league designed to be a minor league operation in comparison to Major League Baseball. However, the primary goal was to challenge the American and National Leagues by using financial incentives to attract top talent. The Federal League was not subscribing to a business model based on the reserve clause, which Major League Baseball was adhering to, and they were comfortable offering salary increases and long-term contracts to ball players, which Major League Baseball was not doing at this point in time. So both the American and National Leagues began to see their top talent leave for the Federal League. Major League Baseball was really angry over this, and they did not like the tactics that the Federal League was using. So what they did was they threatened to blacklist the ball players who jumped ship to go to the Federal League and decided to bring lawsuits against them as well. Therefore, the Federal League responded to Major League Baseball and sued them in January 1915. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The judge overseeing the case was a man by the name of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. In 1920, he became Major League Baseball's first commissioner. Mount Judge Landis made a decision and said to both parties, try to settle the matter without the court's involvement. Because as time would let us know, and in history would let us know, Landis's thought process was that Major League Baseball was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act, but he didn't say it at the time. But by November 1915, the Federal League and Major League Baseball came to an understanding. The agreement effectively ended the Federal League, and the owners of ball clubs were paid a combined sum of roughly $600,000, while some were even given the opportunity to purchase Major League ball clubs, such as the Chicago Cubs and the St. Louis Browns. There was one team in Baltimore called the Terrapins. They were pretty upset over the matter because they really wanted to bring professional baseball back to Baltimore, and they did not want to be paid to go away. Major League owners were not kind in their comments regarding the city of Baltimore at that point in time and the future prospects for Major League Baseball. Fast forward 100 years, and Baltimore is this thriving, vibrant center of Major League Baseball. But it wasn't that way in 1915. Major League Baseball was trying to pay $50,000 for the Terrapins to disappear, as if the Federal League never even existed as a rival. The Terrapins rejected the settlement and filed an antitrust lawsuit in 1916. So by April 1919, the Terrapins had won a $240,000 award in trial court. However, it like any court case, it went to the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia in April 1921, and it was overturned. This was the first time that interstate commerce was being talked about and the role of ball players was being discussed in baseball. Because up until this point, baseball was not viewed as a business. It was purely a sport. It was not viewed as a business. The thought process was even though ball players crossed state lines to compete, the ball games were local in nature and baseball was simply a sport, not trade. So eventually the case made its way to the United States Supreme Court on April 19th, 1922. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the decision and upheld the ruling on May 29th, 1922. He basically said the business is giving exhibitions of baseball which are purely state affairs. In other words, baseball did not constitute interstate commerce and therefore has antitrust exemption. This is a ruling Major League Baseball holds on to this very day. And it's the most hypocritical thing known to mankind, given the fact that Major League Baseball has 30 franchises in North America. They just finished their opening series between the Los Angeles Dodgers and Chicago Cubs in Tokyo, Japan. According to the court, the players travel from place to place in interstate commerce, but they are not the game, which is local in its beginning and in its end. The fact that the owners produce baseball games as a source of profit, large or small, cannot change the character of the games. They are still sport, not trade. So Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes took it a step further. Baseball exhibitions are purely state affairs and thus did not constitute interstate commerce. Traveling across state lines to stage these exhibitions is a mere incident, not the essential thing. Baseball is not even commerce because personal effort not related to production is not a subject of commerce. So Major League Baseball enjoys this antitrust exemption, whereas the National Football League, the National Basketball Association, the National Hockey League, and the other professional sports leagues in North America, particularly the United States of America, obviously, are not exempt from it. So it is a very complicated, convoluted situation that provides Major League Baseball with this uncharacteristic protection. Congratulations, you have successfully completed Module Learning Objectives 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3. demonstrate an understanding of monopolistic practices in professional sport, explain the differences in the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, and analyze Major League Baseball's exemption from antitrust laws and its impact on how the sport conducts business.